wanted to say thank you to Mish. I know she's not here, but there's so much work that goes on behind the scenes for this to happen. And thank you all for coming to join me here this afternoon as well. I really appreciate it. So my goal today is to introduce the idea of a pelvic floor as being just really one piece of this amazing human machine that is our body, and how those muscles function in conjunction with everything else, but also as part of the whole person, and how particularly the sympathetic nervous system will affect the function of these muscles. So I'd love for you to be able to sit, stand, move, stretch. I know it's been a long day, so if you need to move and shake things off a little bit, that would be awesome. We're going to start with, it is a bit of a chunk of talking to get started, but then we'll also be doing some practical things, so we will get up and move a little bit, not vigorously, but there will be some more practical aspects as well. So this is me with my pelvis. This is Patty, because we're based in Paddington in Brisbane, but I'm a physiotherapist, and my passion for pelvic floor health really started at one of my pracs at uni, where I got to work in a maternity hospital. Just really loved the pre and postnatal side of things, and the education and the willingness of women to learn around that time of their life as well. Such a unique phase. But from my practice, so working in both private and then seeing the hospital systems as well, I started to really realize that pelvic floor dysfunction or pelvic floor issues was definitely not just the result of pregnancy, because I was seeing a lot of women who had never had babies have issues later on, or women even before that, so in their teens, early 20s and 30s, who had never had children, and they were experiencing the same things. And it didn't really seem to matter whether these women were exercises, so whether they were yogis or crossfitters, or if they were what we would put into more of that sedentary category. So this pelvic floor dysfunction seemed to me to be caused by something much bigger than just too intense exercise or not enough exercise or babies. And it was around that time that I did discover Katie Bowman. And has anyone heard of Katie Bowman here? Yeah? I know a few of you have. So she's a biomechanist from the States, and so I do now take a very biomechanical approach to pelvic floor health. But she did her master's in pelvic floor mechanics in particular, and is really inspired by natural movement, whole body movement, and how every cell in your body really responds to how you move throughout your day, but also throughout a lifetime as well. So I did end up certifying as a restorative exercise specialist under her, which has completely changed the way that I move myself, and then how I approach my treatment with my patients. And then, just recently we've opened Body and Birth Physiotherapy, which is our practice in Brisbane. It'll be our 1-year anniversary in October, and it is dedicated mostly to women's health, pelvic floor health, and especially around pregnancy. Okay, so we're going to look at a few different things, but just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, we're going to look at some pelvic floor basics, how the muscles function, and talking about kegals or pelvic floor exercises, whichever you want to call them, and how they can be helpful but sometimes harmful, and we want to try to work out where we can get the most out of them without causing any harm. And then looking at some of the things that we can do to start restoring our pelvic floor health that is safe for any woman at any level or any age as well. Okay, so what is your pelvic floor? We know that it's a complex group of muscles and connective tissue and fascia that provides really some incredibly important functions throughout the body. So controlling bladder and bowel, supporting all of the pelvic organs, essential for intercourse, so reproduction, but also childbirth as well. And they have a huge role in stability, working with your abdominal core muscles, of course, for the pelvis, the hips, and the spine. So really versatile group of muscles. Whoops. That's Patty, a close-up. But you can see that all of the red muscles your pelvic floor, and they do run from your pubic bone at the front to tailbone at the back, and then of course side to side. And these attachments, particularly to the sacrum and the coccyx, can create movement of the pelvic joint, so the sacroiliac joint, and we'll go into that a bit further. And while we often think of the pelvic floor as being a single unit, you can see that these group of muscles is really made up of lots of different smaller parts, but they do all work together. But the coordination and function between each of these muscles is really important as well. So we know that our muscles need to be strong. And in particular, they need to be strong to be able to hold in urine and stool so that we're not leaking when we don't want to. We need them to be strong in order to help stabilize the pelvis. We need them to be strong in order to withstand gravity and any internal pressures that you might be generating inside your abdomen or inside your body, and supporting the pelvic organs against those pressures. But we don't often think about the supple quality, and we really need that balance between the two, because that supple quality is going to allow things to exit when we want them to. So for the complete emptying of both bladder and bowel, to allow for penetration without pain, whether it's during sex, using tampons, or during a pap smear. During childbirth, you can imagine that you want supple muscles that are able to lengthen and give when you're trying to allow a child out of the birth canal. And they also need to be supple in order to have the ability to respond effectively and efficiently in response to any stimulus. So if the muscles are strong but they're stiff, they're not going to be able to respond very quickly or effectively. So when things go wrong, and we're probably familiar with quite a few of these issues, the most common that we see in our population is bladder leakage or urinary incontinence, but we can also have bladder retention, and I see that a fair bit. Bowel incontinence, but on the flip side, we can have constipation or difficulty emptying. Even though the stool might be soft, it might be really hard to get things out, get things moving. Pelvic organ descent and prolapse, so where the pelvic organs, the bladder, bowel, and the uterus can lower down or sometimes come outside of the body as well. Pain with intercourse, or the complete inability to have intercourse due to dysfunction of these pelvic floor muscles, but also the lack of orgasm can be associated with pelvic floor dysfunction as well. And then any joint pain around the pelvic area, so pubic symphysis, sacroiliac, groin pain, tailbone pain, lower back pain can all have a contributing factor. If your pelvic floor muscles aren't doing their job, then it does predispose more to these joint dysfunctions. And then of course, when we add the extra load of a growing baby during pregnancy, plus the lovely hormones that give us a bit more mobility in the pelvis, then these conditions can become a bit more frequent. But if there is a lot of tension in the pelvic floor, that can increase the risk of perineal tearing or trauma during childbirth as well. So unfortunately, we are seeing a bit of a trend in the rise of pelvic floor dysfunction in our Western population in particular. So the stats that we're all familiar with is 1 in 3 after pregnancy, 1 in 3 women will have urinary incontinence. But pregnancy and childbirth is something that we're made to do, we're born to do. So this natural biological function is something that we should be able to do without consequence. Yet so many of us are experiencing issues related to pregnancy. A 2011 study showed that up to 67.5% of women will experience some type of pelvic floor dysfunction in their lifetime. And then another US study is just showing that there's going to be quite a rise. This is from the States, of course, but over the next couple of decades, we're going to see a lot more. And clinically, so in my experience, and this is what really got me trying to look a little bit further beyond just the pre and postnatal causes, is that I've been seeing teenagers, young women experiencing these pelvic floor issues, and it is definitely not related to pregnancy for this population. So the question is, why? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the habits, or maybe things that we all have in common that might be contributing to pelvic floor dysfunction, but things that we can change right away. Okay, so was anyone also in Julie Weeb's session today? Yeah. So some of this you might find familiar from her discussion. So a lot of it is complementary. Some may not directly correspond, but we'll just roll with it. So when we're looking at the pelvic floor muscles, we know that they function not in isolation, but as part of this core canister. So your core stability is really derived from the function of your diaphragm on top, your pelvic floor at the bottom, your abdominal muscles all the way around, and then your deep spinal stabilizers of the multifidus. And so all of these muscles work together and never in isolation. Your diaphragm and your pelvic floor definitely move in sync. So you can see it on a functional MRI that the pelvic floor muscles have a reciprocal relationship. So as you inhale, your lungs fill with air, your ribs expand, your diaphragm flattens, and your pelvic floor will also flatten and have a little bit of give. So if we're thinking pelvic floor muscles through their range of motion, when you contract the muscles would be a lift up, when you relax then they lower down. So your inhale is more in time, I guess, with the relaxation phase of a pelvic floor contraction. And when you exhale, you can probably feel your abdominal muscles will contract, your pelvic floor muscles are going to lift in sync. And that's to maintain a constant pressure within the abdominal canister to help with that dynamic stability. So I'm glad we're on the same page, Julie and I, and that I wasn't saying the opposite, because that would be really awkward. Can we just try though? So is everybody familiar with a pelvic floor contraction or being able to lift and tighten those muscles? So if you can try, and if you've probably seen this as well, I'll get you to inhale at the same time as trying to contract your pelvic floor. And just notice how easy it is to do, or how easy it might be to hold up there. And then if you try the opposite, so if you try a normal breath in first, and then on the exhale, you're going to contract your pelvic floor. Does it feel any different for you? Easier? Yeah. So there's just much less resistance to contracting your pelvic floor. Instead of working against the pressure, or against the natural movement that should be happening as you breathe, a lot of women will inhale and hold the breath as they try this contraction. So it's kind of the opposite. So if you do see anyone practicing pelvic floor exercises, or if you are teaching them, just make sure that it's in time with the diaphragmatic movement. All right, so another way that the pelvic floor muscles function is in response to stress. So does anybody hold tension or tightness in their shoulders or their neck? Yeah. A lot of us also hold tension in our pelvic floor without realizing it. And there's actually been some really interesting studies to show, I think they had vaginal probes, so they're measuring the activity of the pelvic floor and showing a group of women, even just images of something scary, whether it was a car accident or something that would elicit more of a fear or a shock response. And inevitably, the pelvic floor muscles would contract in response to that, even more than if it was something that was arousing or compared to any other picture. So in response to a threat, whether it's a physical or perceived threat, your pelvic floor muscles are going to contract. So they're very integrated with your sympathetic nervous system and a part of that natural fight and flight response. So that if you are having to run away from a big fuzzy, long clawed, big teethed predator, you don't have to stop mid-run to empty your bladder. You can just get the heck out of there. They also have a reflexive contraction in response to pain or instability. So I often think of it as kind of a protective muscle guarding. If you've got pain in your lower back, chances are your pelvic floor, some of your deep hip muscles will be contracting a little bit more in order to help protect you, even though it may not be the most functional response at the time, but it is a natural response of the body. How else do they respond? So in response to load. And this reflexive response is the same as the way that your abdominal muscles will respond to keep you upright against gravity. So all day long, you're probably not thinking, okay, spinal muscles, abdominal muscles switch on so that I don't just collapse in a heap of bones. Your pelvic floor muscles, no matter what you're doing, whenever you're upright, are working against gravity to support your pelvic organs and to provide that stability to your pelvis. So we've got this kind of equal and opposite force happening to keep everything functioning well. So we talked about the attachment of the pelvic floor to the sacrum before, and while there's not a huge amount of movement, the sacroiliac joint does allow for movement of the sacrum within the pelvis. So when the pelvic floor muscles contract, in order to close any of the openings in the pelvis or to lift against gravity, it actually pulls the sacrum inwards into counternutation. So in order for it to have that effective closing and lifting, we need something else to happen. So if the pelvic floor muscles were just working in isolation, nothing else in the body is going on, then there's going to be a net amount of movement of the sacrum inwards, which, if you can imagine, your pelvic floor muscles pulling and working from a non-stable base, we're going to end up with less leverage for those muscles to then lift and contract. So what we need is a strong butt in order to stabilize the sacrum, to provide that leverage and the ability of the muscles to then work in response to that load, so that they can go up. Okay, in squatting, so we know that when the pelvic floor muscles contract, the sacrum comes in. But squatting is an action, or rather a position, that's often recommended for childbirth. And the reason for that is that it creates more space in the pelvis, up to about 28% more, which is pretty cool. And so during childbirth, of course, we want to allow the most amount of space possible so that there's less resistance to baby, so that there's easier delivery through the pelvic outlet. But it also allows for relaxation of the puborectalis muscle. Has anyone seen the squatty potty video? Yes? No? Oh, it's hilarious, and you should probably definitely look it up if you haven't seen it already. But it really has a great visual of how the pelvic floor muscles are able to relax when you're in a squatting position, to allow the bowel to unkink. So there's much less resistance, and it's much easier to get things out. So it is a much more natural position for us to empty both bladder and bowel. And because this does create more space in the pelvis, we've got a gentle overall lengthening of the pelvic floor muscles as well. So why are we seeing more pelvic floor issues? If the pelvic floor muscles are working with all of these things that we've just talking about, then why are we seeing more dysfunction? And this phrase, "you are how you move," coined by Katie Bowman, really looks at how the way that you are what you eat, your entire body, down to a cellular level, is constantly responding to how you move. And so therefore the health of your pelvic floor plus your entire body is a result of how you have moved every day for probably your entire life. So we're all familiar with the adaptation that can come about from doing specific exercise or going to the gym, but our bodies are constantly adapting to loads. Unfortunately, not just while we exercise, for the 3 to 4 times a week for 40 to 60 minutes a day, which is the average or the recommended for our population. So we need to look a little bit beyond just the time that we spend exercising and look at what we're doing for the rest of the 23 hours of the day. So why are we seeing more dysfunction? Less overall movement throughout the day. We really do live in a very sedentary culture. A lot of us are required to be still for our jobs, but everything in this world that we live in now is just so convenient. We don't have to walk to gather water from the well or the stream, depending on how far back you want to go. Everything's right there for us. Not only do we not move enough, but we also spend most of our lives in a single repetitive position. Does anyone feel like standing up right about now? Yeah? Feel free to. So feel free to move and stretch and do whatever you like. But most people in our culture are required to sit for work for long hours every day. But we also sit to commute. We sit to have most meals. We sit for relaxation time. We sit to go to the toilet. The list is endless. So really, all of this time that we spend sitting will lead to our bodies adapting to whatever we do most frequently. So short hip flexors, tight hammies, sound familiar? It's also going to lead to less durable core and pelvic floor muscles. Crappy posture is rampant within our culture, and especially the younger generations as well. So that's going to really determine how your bodies can respond to load, the position that you're in, but also whether you're using your muscles, or if when you're in that sitting position, are we outsourcing the work of our core and our pelvic floor and our spinal muscles to something like a chair. Not only will if we're sitting especially with poor posture, if there's pressure on your sacrum. So we talked about before how when you contract your pelvic floor muscles, it will lead to the sacrum being pulled forward. If we are passively pushing the sacrum in towards the pubic bone within the pelvis, then we are placing the pelvic floor muscles into a shortened position, and over time, they will adapt to that shortened position. But instead of them just staying in, if we're thinking sarcomere models, then they're not going to stay in this contracted position all the time. They're actually going to lose sarcomeres so that we end up with a shorter pelvic floor because our body's efficient. It's not going to waste energy feeding the cells and the muscle tissue if you're not going to use it, essentially. So if you're sitting, make sure that there's no pressure on your sacrum. So sarcomerolysis is the process by which our body actually cannibalizes unnecessary sarcomeres if we're not using them. Am I in the way? We don't squat anymore. Beyond probably toddlerhood, there's no real need for us to squat in our daily lives, unless you have a toddler, in which case you might be squatting down more. But if you can imagine, so when we squat, there's more space created in the pelvis. Without moving your muscles through that range of motion, has anybody worn a cast or a brace that's limited your range of motion before? So if I've only ever used my bicep within 70% roughly of its available range, you can imagine how that's going to adapt over time, and how even if I do 1 or 2 squats a day, how that may not lead to me being able to functionally use the full potential availability of the muscles there. So we don't squat, which is a shame. We've become casted due to our lack of squatting. Not that we've had a cast placed upon us, but the fact that we haven't used those muscles means that the same effect has occurred. So that's going to lead to overall loss of muscle length, but also limited movement in your pelvic outlet. So for the younger generations who they sit, probably with crappy posture, the academic demands seem to be much higher on kiddos these days compared to, say, my parents' generation. So for those girls in particular who've been sitting, crappy posture, shortened, less range of motion in the pelvis, shorter pelvic floor muscles, how might that then go on to affect their birthing mechanics as well and their outcomes from birth? Nobody has butts anymore. Flat butt syndrome is everywhere. Has anybody had clients or patients who they just can't activate their glutes, or they don't have glutes, or they can't find their glutes? So without a strong butt, and it's probably a result of prolonged sitting, less movement, no squatting, that we don't have butts. But without the stability of the sacrum, the action of the glutes to stabilize the leverage point, that anchor for your pelvic floor muscles to work off, they're not going to be able to do their job as effectively. So we need a strong butt. Breathing patterns, again, let's just breathe for a moment. In our daily world where we don't need to move as much, there is less demand placed on the body to require us to move. But we also hold a lot of tension in our abdominal muscles. So if we are, whether it's sucking in, or we are bracing, or we've been taught to engage our core all the time, then that's going to have a direct effect on how much you can expand your rib cage, how much diaphragmatic movement you can get, and therefore how much symmetrical pelvic floor movement you can get. So we end up with a stiff diaphragm plus a stiff pelvic floor that's not really ready or able to adapt to those sudden demands, whether it's a jump or a sneeze or a cough. So can we try, everyone find your most slouched posture and try take a breath here. What do you feel moving? Yeah, so it's mostly abdominal movement here. What if we were able to then find more of a good long tall posture, and we're taking a deep breath here? What do we notice? Yeah, so some chest breathing, but do we also feel some expansion of the rib cage? So this is really what we're after. To get good diaphragmatic movement, we're looking for that lateral costal expansion of the rib cage, both side to side and also forward and back. So now try that breath. We're thinking that diaphragmatic breath, but we're going to engage our core, because I'm in a bikini and I don't want anyone to know that I have an abdomen. And just try to take a breath here. And notice how much that might affect how you can breathe. And Julie actually had a really great discussion as well about particularly athletes, and when people are exercising, if they use that bracing or if they're holding their breath while they're exercising, how that's then going to affect the pressure inside the body and then the function of the pelvic floor. So that was awesome. Okay. Who ever feels stressed? So if we think back to hunter-gatherer days, when our fight and flight response is really designed to help us survive. So most often the threat that would be presented to us would be usually a predator coming after us, and so we would need to be able to recruit our muscles in order to either try to fight off this thing or get the heck out of there. But now our body still has the same response to threat, regardless of whether it's a physical threat where that type of response might be appropriate, or it could be because you got an email that you just really didn't want to get that day, or you didn't get enough sleep, or somebody beeped at you in traffic, or there's, like, the list goes on and on. We're just constantly exposed to so much more stress in our lives, and that can even just be the constant input of light and sound as well. So it can be even that simple. Plus, if we don't breathe, if you could imagine breathing really shallowly for a certain amount of time, how that can feed back into your sympathetic nervous system and ramp up that tension or that stress level and all those hormones too. So they do always feed into each other. So we can see that the pelvic floor muscles definitely don't exist in a vacuum. They work just as part of this entire system, but are totally integrated with your sympathetic nervous system, and just you as a person as well. So, kegals. Is everyone familiar with the word kegel? Yeah? I actually had no idea what a kegel was when I first moved to Canada, and it took me a long time to realize that it was just a pelvic floor contraction, a pelvic floor exercise that they were actually talking about. But kegels are coined as an exercise by Dr. Arnold Kegel in 1948, so it's he was a gynecologist and really wanted women to have an option of being able to strengthen these muscles or finding something else for them to do as an alternative to surgery, which can often be quite drastic and not always have the results that we desire. And so this isolated pelvic floor contraction is usually taught with verbal cues or with descriptive cues. And so we can think, imagine tightening and lifting. We've got drawing the pelvic floor up and in, pretend you're stopping urine. And my favorite is try not to fart in front of the queen. So making sure that you're getting that posterior component of the muscles working as well. But now pelvic floor exercises are used as kind of a blanket prescription for everyone. Especially if you're having a baby, make sure you do your pelvic floor exercises so that you're not going to have issues later on. And it's the kind of be-all and end-all of pelvic floor health, really. We tend to focus on the idea that more strength is better, and women are taught to contract and hold all day long. And if you're in Julie's talk, she was talking about how women will often try to hold a pelvic floor contraction for an entire run, or at the very least, every time that you cough, sneeze, pick up your kids, breathe, get out of a chair, squat. You know, we're just taught to contract those muscles consciously all the time. And with all the cues, oh yeah, I have actually seen this on a handout before, where the recommendation was for women to contract their pelvic floor as an exercise 200 times a day for the rest of their life, which isn't really feasible. I mean, who's going to stick to that kind of exercise prescription? But generally, the recommendation these days is 3 sets of 10 reps for 10-second holds, plus some quick flicks as well. But rarely are we taught to actually let go of these muscles. And so think of the cues that you would associate with a pelvic floor contraction. It's tighten, hold, squeeze, contract, lift. There's never the opposite side of the spectrum where we get to let go of that tension. So this overactive pelvic floor is really quite common. So considering all the ways that we know that the pelvic floor muscles work in response to load, we need your butt, we need to breathe, just training the strength of that isolated contraction may not give you the results that you're looking for if you're trying to resolve pelvic floor dysfunction. And because we miss out on how they function as part of the whole body. But sometimes kegals are too much. So as I mentioned, some people have more of that overactive pelvic floor, but we know that just from being given verbal cues or from reading how to do pelvic floor exercises, that some women are actually bearing down instead and causing more pressure, placing more pressure on their pelvic organs, which is causing more issues. So without guidance, and I find without good cueing, and I tend not to teach them unless I can do an internal exam, but I know not everyone can do that, then I tend not to teach them as an exercise to do those contractions without really focusing on that release of the muscle as well. And clinically, I do see that the majority of my patients have too much tightness in their muscles rather than weakness. Even women who have issues that we would usually associate with weakness, so incontinence or prolapse. If you can imagine that your muscle is already contracted and then you suddenly sneeze, there's just nowhere really for that muscle to go in order to provide that pressure or closure to the urethra to stop any leaking from happening. Compared to if you had a supple pelvic floor that was ready to go at any time, and then you sneezed, you've got so much more room for the muscle to contract to stop that leaking from happening. So that's just looking at the length-tension relationship that all muscles have based on the sarcomere model, or sliding filament theory of the muscles. So we want muscles to be really within this optimal length rather than just in their extreme ends, range of motion. And interestingly, or maybe not, I think it's interesting, I have a lot of women who clinically, if I'm testing them internally, they have what I would call 5 out of 5 strength of contraction of their pelvic floor muscles, but they're still having incontinence and they still have a prolapse. So just pursuing that, strengthening that squeezing of the pelvic floor muscles really isn't going to solve their issues if they've already got that strength. Your pelvic floor muscles need to work at a whole range of different levels. So while you're sitting right now, your pelvic floor muscles are working just in response to gravity. If you were standing, they'd be working a little bit more. If you were walking, they'd be working a little bit more. If you were walking and holding a child, they'd be working more. If you were running, they'd be working a bit more. So your pelvic floor muscles need to work at just an infinite range of different levels throughout every single day and throughout a workout. So this idea of strengthening the muscles just at a single level, or pre-contracting and just engaging your pelvic floor muscles at the same level every single time before you do a particular exercise, may not allow those muscles to work at the most appropriate level that they need to, and it actually inhibits how well they can respond automatically or reflexively in response to that stimulus. And strength does not equal function. we can see. So we really need to look at how the muscles work as part of the whole. Pelvic floor dysfunction, I find, is not always the problem. So incontinence is not just pelvic floor weakness, but it is a symptom. Pelvic floor dysfunction is a symptom of something in this system not working properly. So coming back to looking at that bigger picture. We get to move a little bit, yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk about alignment. And these are things that I'd love for you to start to look at on yourself, but also when you're working with other people. Maybe don't tell them at first that you're checking them out, but you can start to give them some really simple tips on how to start to allow their bodies to recruit their pelvic floor muscles a little bit better. So these alignment points are from Katie Bowman's teachings, A Nutritious Movement, and they're very much from a biomechanical perspective, and there will be some clashes with Julie Weeb. Okay, so the good news, when you are standing up or sitting up, or whenever you are upright, your pelvic floor muscles are constantly responding to gravity or whatever loads and pressures are being placed on them, which means that throughout the day, your pelvic floor muscles are kind of strengthening all the time. Woohoo!
Is that the case in someone who has prolapse as well?
The pelvic floor muscles are still going to be responding, yeah. Whether they're doing enough to support the organs or not. Sometimes they're actually working even more, because if the pelvic organs are sitting directly on your pelvic floor muscles, that's a lot more load than they would be experiencing otherwise. Yeah. Is there a question? No. Unfortunately, a lot of us sit and stand in a way that takes our pelvic floor muscles out of the plane where they can respond to gravity, and they're in this horizontal plane, to where they can't really do much from here. So we need to find good alignment to start letting our pelvic floor muscles just work throughout the day. Who was in Julie Weeb's again? So hips over heels is one of the easiest things that I find to cue for people. So let's come on to stand up. Everyone come up. So we've got mirrors here as well. Just stand how you might usually. See if you can check yourself out in a mirror from a side-on perspective. And just have a look at where your pelvis kind of lines up over your feet. Is your weight kind of more distributed? Is it more in the balls of your feet, in your midfoot, or more in your heels? And that's going to change depending on the shoes that you're wearing as well, just so you know. So if you go forward for a moment, we'll just kind of hang out here. Does this look familiar? Either? Anybody's had kids? Yeah. So if you're out here and just, feel what your butt's doing, what your pelvic floor, what your core might be doing, and then can you bring your weight back so that you're stacked more with your pelvis over your heels, and just notice what happens. So for me, as I bring my weight back, I can feel my core muscles switch on just a little bit. You get to transfer that work to your butt muscles instead, and your pelvic floor, instead of being in this relative posterior tilt where it's actually taken out of the plane where it can respond to gravity, it now gets to be brought back into that plane. Does anyone feel like they're falling backwards when they take their weight back? No? Yes? So some people will often feel like to get your weight back, you tend to lean with your upper body, which will make you feel a little bit unsteady. If you can think pulling your bum back first, and you might have to stick your butt out a little bit in order to not fall over. Does that feel any different? If you think butt out? Cool. All right, so now we get to use your glutes. We've got a neutral pelvis without thinking too hard about it. But this is especially important when you're subjecting yourself to load, whether it's carrying someone or doing a workout. Particularly these, I often see this, which is going to not allow for great stability of your spine or your pelvic floor. So if we're looking at a line of gravity, so I'll often use a plumb line, just a piece of string, and I've got an old lock on it. And you can line it up with the middle of your pelvis or greater trochanter and let it drop straight down. It should fall directly down over your ankle, your lateral malleolus, as opposed to the midfoot or the ball of your feet. Cool. Awesome. So that's what we're after. And Now that you're standing, check out your feet and just notice which way are your toes pointing. So a lot of us do tend to have more of a toes turned out position that is most comfortable and natural for you. That's cool. But what effect does that have on your hips and your pelvis? Sorry. So if you think about the muscles of your hips, particularly your deep hip rotators, so your piriformis, for example, runs from your sacrum out to your greater trochanter. When your feet are in an externally, or when your hips are in an externally rotated position, or your feet are turned out, that's going to place your piriformis muscle into a shortened position. Spend enough time there. Has anyone ever had tight hips or tight piriformis? You need to stretch it and roll it all the time. Just by getting your toes pointing straight ahead, you're allowing that muscle feels, yeah, it can be. So if you've been somebody who's had your toes turned out for a long time, you probably don't want to go straight to toes straight, but you would gradually work your way in over time, because that's going to stretch a lot of those deep hip muscles, and you don't want to overdo it all at once. But now you get to stretch without stretching. The other effect that it has as well, can everybody find their sit bones or your ischial tuberosities? Get right in there. And try again. So if you turn your feet all the way out, what do you notice happen with those bones? They come closer together. Yeah. So the posterior half of the pelvis will actually narrow when you're in more of that turned out stance, which is going to put those muscles into a shortened disadvantaged position, and your anterior pelvic floor is now kind of overstretched. If we turn our feet all the way in, which may not be so comfortable for the knees, we've got a lot more space now at the back of the pelvis, but really we've taken the muscles out of that neutral position. So in order to allow your pelvic floor muscles to be in a more neutral length so that they can respond when they need to, toes straight is going to give you a little bit more room to play with, a little bit more leverage.
Does that affect SRJ as well?
It will, yeah.
So people would turn out to be more likely to get sciatic pain or surgical pain?
They can. Well, if your piriformis is shortened and tight all the time, sciatic pain is going to be right up your alley, and that's going to affect that stability of all of the hip and pelvic joints. Yeah. Okay, so those are two really easy things that if you're working with clients or patients, try standing with your feet back and see if you can get your toes a little bit straighter. So neutral pelvis, and there's lots of different definitions of what a neutral pelvis is. I tend to use it more of a guideline, but your ASIS, so the bony bits at the front of your pelvis, and your pubic symphysis, so if you run your tummy right off and find that first bony bit, those 2 points should be vertical together. So if you over-exaggerate for a moment and tuck your bum under into a significant posterior pelvic tilt, you feel your pelvic floor, your pubic symphysis move much more in front of your hip bone. And if you went the other way, so if you really stuck out your butt, exaggerating an anterior pelvic tilt, you'll feel it move the other way. So we're just looking for that middle ground where we can allow the pelvic floor muscles to be in more of that horizontal plane where they can respond to gravity, as opposed to where they can't respond to the load that's still coming from this direction. Cool. And then from there as well, that's also going to allow the rest of your vertebrae to just stack on top of each other to find that neutral spine, as opposed to your muscles having to work so much harder to keep you upright against gravity. I got a little bit carried away with these lines. Okay, sitting alignment. We don't have anything to sit on apart from bolsters and things, but we can. This is pretty self-explanatory. Feel free to sit or move again, whatever's comfortable for you. So sitting alignment, we're still looking for a neutral pelvis. And sometimes it's easier to find when you're sitting as well, although not as easy with a heavily pregnant client. It's hard to find those bony markers. But you still want to find ASIS and pubic symphysis, vertical. Or you can just get your weight on your sit bones, and definitely make sure that you're not on your sacrum, because we know that that's not going to allow for your pelvic floor muscles to do their job very well. However, we don't want to overcorrect. So oftentimes when people find more of a neutral pelvis, this will happen at the same time. So they'll thrust their ribs because they're not used to moving these parts separately. Everything always goes together. But you should be able to have your upper body, your ribs just kind of relaxed and still find that neutral pelvis. Okay, squatting. That's me. So there's tons of benefits to squatting. And we talked about how it allows the muscles to move through their full range of motion, so it provides a gentle lengthening or stretch of the pelvic floor muscles. It also helps to build whole body strength, so you can't squat down without using some other muscles as well, especially your glutes. And because as you go down into a squat, your glutes and your pelvic floor are working at the same time, then it's the perfect kind of opportunity to allow for that stabilizing of the sacrum while you're strengthening your pelvic floor muscles, which we don't always get. It also helps to maintain joint mobility everywhere else, so not just the pelvis, but your hips, knees, and ankles as well. And it's also the most efficient position to go to the toilet, as we mentioned before. So that's my squatty potty. I really have a hard time without it. However, squatting is usually something that's cautioned against for people who have pelvic floor issues. And so in a population like ours, which hasn't squatted for most of their life, there's going to be a few more risks. So if you don't have the pelvic floor strength or function in order to work even just throughout your day or when you're sneezing or coughing or exercising, then going down into a squat does increase the load a little bit more, and so it can have detrimental effects to your pelvic floor. Plus, if you don't have the range of motion or the strength to be able to lower yourself down and get back up, then you're going to be over-recruiting a lot of your abdominal muscles, probably holding your breath, and then creating a lot more pressure down. So we won't go straight into a squat for a lot of people. And a lot of people just don't have that joint range of motion either. I've been practicing this for a while. I'm just gonna keep working on it. It took me about a year to be able to squat down without my heels lifting up. Anybody who feels like they want to try, do you want to try a squat and just see what your current range of motion is like at the moment? Easy. Sorry?
How far apart?
So about hip width. Yeah, maybe a little bit wider than hip width. Yeah. So if you can, a lot of people find it's easier to squat if it's a very wide squat or if your feet are turned out, because that takes some of the stretch off, particularly your calf muscles and your hips. So if you're tighter, it's going to be easier to do it that way. Yeah. But for most of us, the heels will come off a little bit sooner before you get all the way down. But I'm probably talking to the wrong population to see a lot of that. Cool. All right. So how do we start safely? If we know that somebody's got some pelvic floor issues, or maybe we're not sure, but we want to make sure that we're not exacerbating any pelvic floor issues, hands and knees can be a really, really nice option. So this is going to allow us to find that range of motion of the knees, the hips, the pelvis. It's unloaded, so there's no stress on the pelvic floor, but we're still able to get that lengthening of your pelvic floor muscles. So everybody come to hands and knees. And get you to start by just relaxing your spine all the way down, so that your tailbone is kind of the highest point of your pelvis. And then you're going to sit your bum back towards your heels just a little bit. But we will pay attention here to that tucking of your pelvis. So the same way that as you go down, you're going to feel that butt wink happen, then we want to try to work within your non-butt winking range here as well. So only sit as far back as you can before you feel that tucking of the pelvis. Yeah, and there's lots of mirrors around, so use them. That's why I asked for this room. Use the mirrors from a side perspective. Cool. All right. And so it's not quite a child's pose, so you're not aiming to go all the way back to your bum. But see if you can get your toes tucked under at the back as well. Yep. Cool. And then you can relax down onto your elbows. So if you flipped yourself upright from here, you would be in a deep squat. Yeah. So we're getting that range of motion, we're lengthening the pelvic floor, but without any load or pressure. And so this is safe for pregnant mamas right up to 40 weeks. This is safe to do early postpartum within the first 24 hours, as long as you feel comfortable. The only people who have had trouble with this, sometimes if they've had some shoulder issues, but it's just starting to allow you to work into different ranges of motion and gain that. Cool. Releasing tension. So we talked about how a lot of us have a habit of sucking in the stomach or tensing the abdominal muscles a little bit. But this is going to lead to an overall increased amount of tension in your tummy, and limit the same way if your pelvic floor muscles are already here, they can't respond very quickly or effectively to a sudden stimulus. If your core muscles are switched on all the time, you're not going to be able to respond that effectively either. So everything's just stiff. And it's also going to recruit your pelvic floor muscles. So your pelvic floor and your TA in particular, they have interlinking muscle fibers once everything connects together. So they do work in sync with each other. But while we think that just this is happening, so our abdominal wall is pulling inwards, what else is happening? There's going to be a net pressure downwards. There might also be a net pressure upwards if we're just pulling in around the middle. So that's going to affect your digestive system, which needs to move downwards. Your menses, so when you have your period, that needs to move down. If you're sucking in your stomach all the time, that can lead to painful periods, even more so. It's also going to push outwards. And particularly for a postpartum population, the linea alba is going to be just have a little bit more give in it than our other gals. So that pressure is going to push on whatever has the most give, which tends to be the linea alba. And you're also going to get some pushback onto your spinal discs as well. So really, that's what's happening, instead of just that pulling the tummy muscles in. But why do we do it? And this is a tricky one, because it's such a part of our culture. Sorry? Yeah, the aesthetic. Yeah. Any other suggestions for why we might contract our stomach? Stress, yeah. And you're not breathing, so you're not relaxing your tummy. So yeah, it all feeds in to it. Anything else? No. I've definitely cued my patients back in the day to engage your core, and we often teach bracing. Yeah. And so a lot of women think that they need to brace every time that they do anything. So this is what we need to do. While I might think that in my head I look like the picture on the left, really what I'm wanting to achieve is the picture on the right. And so if that's my real stomach, and actually I'm wearing exactly the same thing right now. It's my favorite outfit. If this is my stomach, and if I pull it in, where does that go? And that's where you get all of those pressure changes and pushing things in places where they shouldn't really go. But it's not easy to let it go. It's a habit that most of us have had from a very young age. And I remember my mum telling me to pull in my stomach as well. That's another reason why we might be holding tension. Or if you're a ballet dancer.
Between just letting it all go and the being intense, so like a natural abdominal tone.
Yeah. If you're upright and you're not collapsing, your core muscles are working. So you need to, we're trying to find the point where you are not consciously switching them on to allow them to work.
The population go from overactivating external muscles to switching off everything. So what was holding them in that position doesn't do it anymore.
If you can be here, then you're probably using a good amount of tension if you let it go. Yeah. Cool. So it's not always easy for people to do it standing up. Although some mamas, if they do have quite a significant diastasis postpartum, they won't feel very comfortable doing this on hands and knees. But let's all come and release the belly. So hands and knees, we're going to soften the spine as much as you can And if anyone can get their belly button to touch the floor, you get $100. Just kidding, I didn't bring any cash. So this can be a nice position to start practicing, and it can take a while. So it can take a couple of minutes for you to really start to let go of those abdominal muscles, especially if it's a habit that you've had for a really long time. Awesome. Cool. And let's just come down into the hands and knees squat prep again. So you're already in that position pretty much all the way. We just need to sit back a little and then come down onto your on your elbows. And this is sometimes quite a nice thing to feel. Try a couple of deep breaths here. So you should feel your rib cage expanding as you take a deep breath. You should feel some gentle movement in your abdomen. Can you also feel a bit of movement in your pelvic floor? Yeah, I find I don't really notice it unless I really concentrate on it. But if you allow it, then that movement will happen without you needing to force it or think about it. Cool. All right, come on up when you're ready. And so I'll often stay in that position or prescribe it as a stretch or an exercise for people and suggest that they stay there for a minute or two at a time, or just as long as they feel comfortable. And especially for pregnant mamas preparing for a vaginal delivery as well, because you're lengthening, stretching your pelvic floor muscles. You're getting the weight of baby off your back for a moment, which can be really nice. And plus, a lot of those forward-leaning positions can help with some fetal positioning as well. And then try it at the beach. But that might take a little while once you start to feel comfortable in your skin. So we need to also release the pelvic floor. We talked about how we often hold some stress or tension in our pelvic floor muscles. We need to let it go in order to allow it to work responsively and reflexively, depending on whatever we're doing. So this can be done in any position, but I do really like to use your diaphragm. So the way that we just did it on hands and knees before, allowing those muscles to move in sync, but of course you can do it sitting and standing as well. So if everyone can just, unless you've already done it, check in with your pelvic floor. Are you holding any tension there, or can you actually let go of a little bit without peeing? So the most appropriate amount of tension in your pelvic floor is really as little as possible without your bladder empty, for example. So a lot of us tend to, we're holding more than we need to. Strength is just more, it's not necessarily better. And in this case, it will inhibit the function of your pelvic floor muscles. I do often try getting women to contract up a little bit first if they're having trouble finding the release, because it's really hard to just let something go if you don't know that you're holding it. But if you can try contract up a little first, then you might be able to work out which is the opposite direction, and then can you relax back down. I also do teach my ladies what I call a reverse kegel. So it's imagining that the muscles, and for me, if I'm relaxing my pelvic floor, it's not just not contracting, because I've been an overactive pelvic floor, holding a lot of tension there all the time as well. So I need to consciously think, okay, muscles down, and work in the other direction. And so it almost feels like a little bit of a push downwards, but it's not a push where it's pressure coming from your stomach, you're not bearing down, but it's just the muscles almost moving the other way, or working the other way. And I tend to only try to teach this during an internal assessment so that I can tell if they're doing it incorrectly, because I don't want them to be causing any further harm. But I found this amazing. I had a couple of ladies who had stress urinary incontinence. Every time that they cough or sneeze, they've been taught the knack, so they would contract their pelvic floor before they sneezed, but they would still have leakage every time. And so just by teaching them to let go of their pelvic floor first, so it's very counterintuitive, but if you can relax your pelvic floor muscles first, allow them to respond in their own, they actually didn't have any leaking after that, which was pretty cool. So yeah, let it go. As practitioners and health professionals and fitness professionals, we have very much gotten into the we're very aware of core and the need for pelvic floor strength, but perhaps we don't need to cue it all the time, and especially not cueing that constant same level of contraction all the time. So if you are wanting them to, tune in and make sure that they are using their core muscles, that's cool. But make sure that it's appropriate for the amount of load, and know that they get them to realize that they can work at, say, 5% or 20% or 80%. They don't have to be doing that 100%, 1 RM all the time. And that's essential for them to be able to respond at different levels. And this is where the blanket prescription of pelvic floor exercises or kegals being as the solution for everybody, I find it a bit tricky, because if they're already overactive or hypertonic, then pelvic floor exercises can often make the issues worse rather than better. So without an internal exam, you can't really tell, but at least if you can guide them to focus on that release just as much, it's just as important as the contraction movement upwards. So, in conclusion, we need a balance of both strength and that supple quality of the muscles. It just works as part of the bigger system. Everything's connected. Clinically, I do see a lot more overactive, hypertonic patients, even early postpartum, and they were like, oh, everything's just weak and floppy down there now. But they're actually still holding so much tension, probably because they've felt like they would be weak, or that they've been experiencing some heaviness, and so they've been working overtime. And function, really, in this case, is more important than strength. So that's our aim. So how can we begin to restore that function? Our bodies are constantly adapting. So your clients might be doing some amazing work during their training sessions, but when they go home, are they just flopping on the couch, or are they just sitting for the rest of the time? So really encouraging movement and movement breaks, standing desks, like transitioning desks, not just standing all the time either. But we really need to look beyond just those sessions of exercise and building some good habits into their everyday lives. Mindful movement and finding good alignment is really important, and because that will just allow for the recruitment of your pelvic floor and your core muscles without you needing to think about switching them on. Squatting is key, but it does take a bit of time, bit of prep work, calf stretching, ham stretching, quad stretching. Building up that strength, slowly working up to getting into a full deep squat. And some people may not ever get there, especially if they've had knee issues or things. Doing that deep camping squat may not be on their radar, and they may not want to anyway, but they'll still get tons of benefit even just from beginning to work on it and doing that hands and knees squat. And we just need to chill out, really, and let go of a lot of that excessive tension or tightness that we might be holding. So if people are like, I don't know where to start, or if you're wanting to have any pictures, or particularly of the alignment, talking about squatting, on my website, that's my website, you can click here, which is where you can download our free pelvic health ebook. So it goes through a lot of the similar things that we talked about today, but it's very patient friendly, and so you can direct anyone there if they're wanting to work on some of this stuff on their own. So connect with me. And you can, through my website, you can find my email address. Email me anytime if you have questions. I just really love people to have, to be able to find the information that they're seeking, really. And then we're all over the social medias, so we'd love to get in touch. And it's really nice to see people who I'd only met on social media before in person, which is so cool, and building those connections across the country, which is awesome. And so the topics that I usually focus on in my social media posts and blogs and all that kind of stuff tends to be pelvic floor health and pregnancy related things, a lot of diastasis recti, and then natural movement as well, because that's a new love of mine. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.